Hey everyone, my name is Nick Lambert. I'm the CEO of Doc Labs, and welcome to our latest live event. This topic today is the UK government's new digital ID wallet opportunity. Is this a threat for ID providers or not? Hopefully that's a question that we will answer today. To help us on this journey, we have two very esteemed guests that we're delighted to have on. We have Robin Toombs, who's the CEO of Yoti. And we also have Richard Oliphant, who's the legal consultant at RO Legal Consulting. Thank you for coming on, guys. How are you both?
Yeah, great to see you, Nick.
Yeah,
nice to see you again, Richard.
You too, Robin.
Fantastic. So this is going to be a really good session. And I was saying to you guys before we came on, that's one I'm really excited about. I'm not only interested to be educated by your knowledge of the space as maybe people that are joining us also are. But I think there's a lot of things happening around this kind of new data use and access bill, which kind of supersedes the previous bill, data protection and digital information bill, within which there's a much more kind of establishment of a robust digital ID trust framework that's going to impact us within the UK. Many have been critical for a number of years over what we have in the UK versus some of the other jurisdictions, namely things like the EU and how progressive they've been. So I think this has obviously garnered a huge amount of interest and activity over the last kind of few months or so. So it's going to be a really interesting session to pick your brains on. The session itself will last for 1 hour. Kind of be mostly a conversation between the three of us. There'll be kind of Q&A for most of that part. And then probably towards the end, I'll then start to get some questions from the audience who thank you very much for tuning in. If you could actually post in some of your questions into Riverside, Francisco will organise that as we go through the session and we'll ask those to the guys at the end. And if you could also pop into the chat, let us know where you're calling in or listening from. That's always good to see from our perspective. So thank you very much for participating. So I will stop waffling on because no one's here to hear me, but I would love to pass over to you guys, maybe Robin first, if you'd be kind enough to intro yourself, and then Richard, if you'd be kind enough to do the same, and then we can get started.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Robin Toombs. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Yoti. And Yoti is a UK-based identity platform business. We have a reusable digital identity, the Yoti app. We also white label that for Lloyds Bank in the UK market, Smart ID, and for the post office, Easy ID. We also have a standalone ID verification business, age verification, and e-sign business.
Awesome. Thank you, Robin. Thanks again for being with us. And what about you, Richard?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Hello, everybody. So I'm a lawyer specializing in cloud computing, data privacy, e-signing platforms, and most importantly for today's webinar, digital identity schemes. My clients include DocuSign, Adobe, and the Land Registry. They also act for a number of the leading identity providers that have been certified against the trust framework, including DigIdentity, OneID, and sharing.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks to you as well for coming on. So we're going to get straight into it, Richard. Using your knowledge of obviously the law, and I know you pore over these bills, you put lots of really insightful takes on what's happening, certainly within LinkedIn, where I see a lot of them. But what's your take on Richard, within the Data Use and Access Bill, which has now passed through the House of Lords, I think? Can you maybe articulate a little bit more about what that means for digital ID wallets?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And what are the kind of some of the use cases, just building on that, where they will be used, do you think?
Yeah, well, you alluded to it in the introduction that this bill's had quite a long gestation period. So there were digital identity provisions in this bill that were in the predecessor DPDI bill, which didn't make it through Parliament. So it's been a very protracted process. But as and when the bill receives royal assent, it will put our trust framework onto a statutory footing. I think that's a really important milestone. We've already got around 50 identity providers that have been certified against the rules and standards of the trust framework. But to some extent, they've been handicapped by the fact that this trust framework is still on a non-statutory footing. So I think the introduction of the bill into law is going to have a galvanizing effect on market adoption. Many of these identity providers, like Yoti, they have a digital wallet which can be stored as an app on the user's phone. Once the user's verified, then they can use their digital wallet to prove their identity, to prove age, to prove eligibility to service providers in the private sector. But it's very important to note at the outset that this trust framework only applies to private sector use cases. And I'm sure this is something that we're going to be discussing in more depth later on. But we have a separate system called the One Login system, which is overseen by the Government Digital Service. And that's used for signing in and authenticating to online central government services. But to address the second part of your question, Nick, I think we can expect over time to see digital wallets become the favored method for onboarding customers in financial services and to prove age in use cases like buying restricted items, obviously knives, but I think most significantly alcohol. And it all sounds great. I'm sure everybody's nodding in agreement that this is all a good thing, but it would be remiss of me not to point out that there is an important caveat, and that is that the data bill is really only part of the equation. We will still need to see updates to sector-specific regulations. So to give you an example, if we're going to fully capitalize on the obvious potential of using digital wallets to open bank accounts, we're going to require changes to our money laundering regulations. We're going to need to see some tweaks to the Financial Conduct Authority's handbook. And I think most importantly, we'll need to see some changes to the industry guidance, the JMLSG guidance. Similarly, teenage drinkers, they're not going to be able to rush out today with a digital wallet for proof of age in Wetherspoons until such time as Parliament has updated the licensing laws. But the good news is in December last year, the Home Office gave a very clear signal that this will happen by the end of 2025. I'll pause there. I said a lot. I'll hand over to you.
That's great. And in terms of those where regulations have not been passed in certain sectors, Richard, is that significant because in the use case that you cited there in a bit more detail regards alcohol sales, does that mean that they actually can't be used legally within those sectors yet until these sector-specific laws have been implemented?
Yeah, that's right. So the technology is one step ahead of the regulations. So it's incumbent on the regulators to recognize what industry can do with digital wallets and make sure they bring their regulations up to date. So the way to look at the data bill is that it gives you a baseline for introducing digital identities. It's a good thing. But what it doesn't do is make it possible to use the digital wallet in all of these specific industry sectors. That requires changes to those regulations.
Yeah, thank you. Robin, and kind of shifting into yourself there. So we've talked a little bit there about the kind of the private sector and how this bill is really looking at that, kind of shifting gears a little bit into the Gov UK wallet and kind of starting to think there about how we can access government services. We have the driver's licenses also being talked a lot about. I think in January it really started to pick up steam about how we're going to have our version of MDLs is going to be in the UK. And there's going to be this quite significant shift about how citizens interact with government issued ID documents, I guess. What's your own take on how, is this something that's going to be really bigger, or are we getting overexcited too soon for the impact that this is going to have on us?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell exactly how quickly it will have an impact, but I think over time the impact will be very large. I think the fact that government is now saying that they believe a reusable digital identity, either a certified private sector one or the government ID wallet, is something they recognise and want to promote. And even if it's voluntary, it's going to become easier for many individuals to basically use one of those certified ID wallets to do things, whether it be prove age, prove ID, hold credentials on that wallet. There's lots of things that private sector companies would like to issue into wallets. There's lots of things that you would want to do to basically anonymously give some proofs about yourself without divulging too much information. So we certainly at Yoti think, about a quarter of 18 to 22-year-olds already have a Yoti, but they can't use it to prove they're aged by alcohol. They can online, but not in licensed premises, which is where lots and lots of people buy their alcohol. So there's lots of things which, as Richard says, like the legislation has to change so that lots and lots of the extra utilities are opened up. And actually, once those utilities open up, I think a very large percentage of people in the UK will get digital IDs, and that will basically encourage more and more businesses to leverage those digital IDs, and that will encourage more and more people to then get more digital IDs because there's more utility as more businesses recognise them. So I think it's just hard to tell exactly how quickly it happens in New South Wales. In Australia, I think it was only 2 or 3 years before 70-80% of driving licence holders had the digital app, which is a pretty quick adoption curve. In Jersey, half of adults in Jersey got the Yoti app within 2 to 3 years because the government started recognising it, and all of the young people could use it to prove age for alcohol, festival entry, and other such things. So it's a combination, but it is hard to predict just how quick it will happen.
Yeah, and I suppose at least, Robin, where versus places like the US where it's a kind of federated state-based system, that's a far more complex thing to bring to market at speed and at scale. Whereas at least there's some negatives about being centralized the way that we are, but certainly the positives are you can get organized a little bit more quickly as well. So we'll see how that one pans out. And Richard, kind of going back to you, hopefully your kind of sounds is a good bit better. What's your take on the government related stuff? And do you share Robin's kind of thoughts about kind of timescales? Like, how long will it be within some of these sectors? When you kind of, I'm going to answer this the other way around, but as we start to think about some of these private sectors and getting that legislation through, is it 2 to 3 years, would you say, like Robin is maybe suggesting it was for kind of, well, actually it's a separate issue, I suppose. What would you say it is for getting the sector specific legislation through if we're kind of going from a standing start now for those private sectors to be able to start accepting those IDs? And then if you could kind of go from there into the kind of government stuff and your take on the impact that that's going to have in our lives.
Well, I do think it will take a while for the Financial Conduct Authority to make the requisite changes. I think they're moving too slowly, but at the same time, one would hope that the introduction of the data bill, the finalization of the trust framework would be the catalyst for the Financial Conduct Authority to recognize that their regulated members do want to use digital identity to facilitate remote customer onboarding and to improve that customer journey. In terms of what impact these government issued credentials might have, I think it's best to look at that in the context of mobile driving licenses. So today we've got photo card driving licenses. They're not just used as evidence of the holder's eligibility to drive, but they're frequently used as evidence of a person's claimed identity. And the legal basis for this is the government's guidance on identity checking in Good Practice Guide or GPG 45. So I do think that a mobile driving license is going to become a very popular and simple means of proving identity, age, address in both online and face-to-face transactions. And there is one obvious advantage that the mobile driving license has over a photo card driving license, in that the user can selectively disclose attributes about themselves rather than sharing all of that personal data on the face of the photo card driving license. So, for example, a mobile driving license should enable a user to walk into a supermarket, confirm that they're over 18 to buy a bottle of vodka using what's called ZKP or zero knowledge proofing technology, rather than sharing their actual date of birth. So this has got all kinds of privacy advantages for the user. It's giving them much more control over their personal data. It will keep the privacy activists like Big Brother Watch happy too, because they'll see this as a way of supporting the core principle of data minimization under GDPR. And I think most importantly for retailers and for the hospitality industry, this is something that they will embrace. It's going to reduce the risk of underage sales and therefore reduce the risk of a breach of the licensing laws.
Understood. Moving then, Robin, into how this affects different industry players. So we kind of talked a lot about how maybe the government will, these schemes that the government are putting out, and how we as users can or cannot use these different forms of ID that will be coming our way. In terms of identity verification providers already working within this space, how does all this stuff impact them? I'd imagine it's a significant upheaval and that everyone's maybe trying to understand the impact. Do you see this creating, Robin, significant business opportunities for identity verification providers in the UK?
So I think things will be disruptive for sure, and disruptive for a few different reasons. One, it's unclear how much the government intends the government wallet to play a part in this. And, if they're very keen for that to get very high adoption, there are clearly levers they can pull there. So exclusivity in the central government sector, the local government sector, the kind of, public body sector. There's some big parts of the market there. The Companies House, there's 7 million directors on Companies House, the student loan situation, the UCAS. There's just lots and lots of market there, which if the government says you've got to use, if you voluntarily want to do government ID, it's got to be the government one. That will drive a huge amount of adoption for the government wallet. Now, if the government wallet's free for people to use, and maybe somewhat surprisingly, it looks in the Companies House example that they may well make that free, so that ACSPs, that the companies that help form companies on behalf of businesses, they may well be able to link out to individuals, and the individual just goes to the government site and downloads the wallet and freely proves their ID, and the company, the legal firm, doesn't have to pay. That's obviously going to be hugely attractive to those businesses, and the private sector won't have a role to play there. So there's a lot of uncertainty there as to, is the government going to crowd out too much of the market, even if they need private sector identity companies for lots and lots of other user cases where businesses need more than just a proof of ID, and they want SLAs and all sorts. Like the government, it doesn't tend to want to get involved in dealing with businesses and answering call support at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday. So I think that's a big issue, and I think the government's got to think that through very carefully. I think in the private sector, it's going to be certified ID providers who play an important role. Most businesses are not going to be able to, just put a QR code on their site and let you scan it with the government wallet, or go and, look into the API. If the government provides an API, it's going to be more controlled than that. But I think it will be a proper, healthy ecosystem where there's a decent number of ID companies who are certified, who you can go and basically say, look, I want to get, the government ID wallet information, or I want to get other private sector company information. Can you help me? And, there'll be several companies on a list of certified people that you can go and ask that question to and freely choose who to use. I think a lot of IDV providers who up until now have been doing what I think is kind of wave 2 of ID, which is standalone, capture an ID document, capture a face, maybe do another CRA check. That's been a hugely popular part of the market over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And that's not going away in the short term. But I think a lot of businesses will say to those companies, we also want to basically get, if we can, the ID off the person who has got a certified digital ID. Can you help us with that? And I think some IDV providers may step into that consumer market. Some, I think, won't. It's not for the faint-hearted to step into the consumer market if you're normally a B2B brand. But they will probably think, I want to keep my client happy. I want to earn revenue. I don't want to see half of the revenue disappearing off to ID wallets where I'm not facilitating that exchange. So actually, I need to then make it easy for ID wallets to basically flow through my integration with a reliant party so that I can continue to provide a piece of value to that business. And I think everyone in that sector is going to think, I've got to make it easy for the end users to interact with my business that I'm basically contracted with. If I do that, I'm going to keep that business. If I don't do that, I may well get disintermediated. They may well be able to check those digital identities through their fraud business rather than their IDV provider or even their CRM business. There's no good reason why that couldn't be done by non-traditional IDV companies. But logically, if the IDV companies facilitate the use of reusable ID and one-time ID checks, then most businesses are going to continue to consume both of those through their business.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Yeah, that's a really detailed answer. And I was trying to think of a question to pose, but I don't want to put you in an awkward position, but it sounds like there should be a kind of a lot of frustration there maybe on the part of some of the ID&V companies where they're left in limbo of sorts, that they know things are changing, but they maybe don't really know how they're changing, which is, your business is hard enough. I guess that's a frustrating position to be in, I guess. But Richard, maybe kind of following up on this with you, and, for companies in the kind of identity verification or even using identity to access platforms, the identity access management side, what advice would you have for them? What should they be thinking about now when in a world where more people are able to use kind of government issued digital IDs? How do you see the changes impacting them?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that the introduction of government issued digital credentials changes the business for the identity providers as such, because it doesn't really introduce new use cases. I think the real issue here, and it's a contentious one, is whether these identity providers will be permitted to host the mobile driving license and the government issued digital credentials. And the jury is currently out on that. The government minister at the end of January said in Parliament that there are no current plans to allow certified identity providers to store government issued credentials, which of course means that there won't be a level playing field between the DIATF or Trust Framework certified wallets and the government wallet. And I think secondly, it could potentially result in a de facto monopoly for the government wallet. And this isn't really about an ideological battle between the public and private sector. For me, this is about trying to figure out what a vibrant digital identity ecosystem looks like for the UK. And that has to be built on core principles like competition, innovation, diversity, inclusivity, and an ecosystem that delivers economic growth, to use Rachel Reeves' mantra.
I think as well, the other thing that's probably sticking in a few of our heads right now as well is you look at the kind of state of the art, who's the absolute best at customer experience or user experience, and probably the government is not the application developer that springs to mind when you think about that. So I suppose there's also in mind of adoption needs to be easy to use for it to be widely adopted. And I guess if that's been run through the government, again, we simply can't expect that user experience to be as sharp as if it was running through strong technology consumer brands, regardless of where they're from. It will just not be able to do as good a job. So I think that's definitely going to be a factor here that's going to impact adoption.
Yeah, and I think as well, we still have to question why the government thinks it's necessary for taxpayers to fund a government wallet, given that the use cases they've highlighted, notably the alcohol use case, is one that can already be addressed by, 20, 30, 40 certified identity providers. And I think as well, the other question we have to consider is why the government wants to do this, given that when they made their previous attempt with the Verify scheme, it was disastrous and it cost $250 million. So I don't see any need to set up a government wallet, particularly when, and without getting too technical, there is a mechanism in the Data Act which introduces a new information gateway. And the premise behind this is that Yoti, OneID, DigIdentity, they can go to a public authority, which would include, for example, the DVLA or HM Passport Office, and they can say, we want the digital data that you hold so we can put this into our certified wallets. So that gives you a very good means of putting mobile driving licenses and other government issued digital credentials into certified wallets.
Yeah. Robin, you're at the sharp end, like Richard's mentioned Yoti a couple of times, and obviously, we've talked several times ourselves, and I know that you guys are at the sharp end of a lot of this stuff. Can you maybe give us some concrete examples of popular use cases where people are using Yoti today?
So I'll try and do that, and also I think some of that gives maybe some of the additional answers as to why I don't think the government wallet, even if it becomes part of the solution ecosystem, is going to be the only thing that adults use. So, in the UK, some of our most popular user cases, particularly for the reusable digital ID, are things like right to work and DBS. So we do about 150,000 right to work and DBS transactions a month. It's a big part of the business since the government changed the rules in April 2022. And interestingly enough, even though there isn't yet a kind of clear government kind of promoted reusable digital ID, all of the legal, kind of things in place, about a third of all people who do a DBS transaction with us use the reusable ID to do it. So they either create it there and then complete the DBS ID transaction, or they may be doing it for the second or third time. We're 3 years in now, and DBSs are done more than once, sometimes by people in a year. And right to work, a quarter of all people use the app, and that's just our experience. And there's 50 other businesses who are doing this. So there's clearly a desire by some of the market, even at an early point where there isn't a large amount of government kind of promotion and law and utility, that some people recognise that it's just sensible. If you're going to have to prove right to work several times in your life, or even several times a year if you're a young person doing temporary jobs, it doesn't make sense not to store that information and reuse it again, rather than get your passport out again or driving license. So that's a big one. In America, our reusable digital ID is getting increasingly popular to prove age anonymously for porn. It's a sensitive area that not everybody wants to talk about, but the reality is, half of the world is usually accessing porn to a regular or irregular amount of time. And that's a super sensitive thing. You do want that to be, anonymous. You're not going to use a government ID wallet to log into or prove age on lots and lots of porn sites. I think a lot of gamblers are not going to want to, lots of gamblers, go to 5 or 10 sites, and you don't really want to worry about whether the government might be able to see what you're doing. And the government may well say that there's no surveillance in there, but the perception will be that, I'm not sure I believe that, so I'm going to use a private sector wallet to do that. I don't want the CSA, the Child Support Agency, saying to me, well, look, you're not paying the bills, but you seem to have been to 10 gambling sites over the last month. And just that kind of concern just means I just don't think lots of people buying their vapes and all of the other vice things that you need to do to prove age, very unlikely that you're going to want to use the government app to do that. So, other cases, like 1 in 6 of all 18-year-olds for the last 5 years have used Yoti to basically access their child trust funds. So, at the age of 18, you're not yet on the electoral roll, but literally within a week of getting to 18, you want to basically withdraw some or all of your child trust fund money. And the only easy way to do that is to basically get a reusable ID or to do an ID verification. Most young people actually seem very, very comfortable with the idea of getting the app, storing the information, and not thinking that they want to do that several times by going off and getting their passports again. And I think it's important to remember that, yes, there's 45 million driving licenses, 35 full and 9 million provisional, but there's 52 million chip passports. And, regardless of whether the government lets IDPs immediately hold driving licenses or driving license digital credentials, you are always going to be able to basically do a chip read on your passport. Now, unless they start legislating for you not to be able to do that as a citizen, there's not much they can do about that. It's already used in PG 81 for property sales, where the Land Registry has said that is the highest form of level of assurance we can get. And if you do that as a conveyancing business and there is a fraudulent transaction on a property, you are covered on liability. So, the passport chip is super important, and almost everyone in the UK who is digitally active has a passport from the age of, kind of 13 all the way up to, people in their 80s. So the mobile driving license is going to be very important. There'll be lots and lots of awareness and newspaper articles. And when it happens, it's going to be a great thing. But actually, it's the combination, I think, of chip passports and mobile driving licenses and the government opening up some more legislation, which will allow lots and lots more things to be done. We have quite a lot of people who just do peer-to-peer. So we literally get people who tell us, I'm a buyer on a marketplace or I'm a seller on a marketplace. I am doing a Yoti peer-to-peer to give trust to the other party that I am a real face with a verified ID. Now, nothing's perfect in life, but at the moment on a marketplace, you're basically crossing your fingers and hoping you're not going to get scammed. But most people are not scammers. But how do you make it easier to identify who are signaling that they're the honest people? Like the fraudsters clearly don't want to share their verified ID and their verified face if they're going to defraud people. That's not what fraudsters do.
It was interesting, Robin, you're speaking about why people might want private IDs, and it seemed to be a lot about somewhat about privacy, not knowing the government that you were doing certain things or accessing certain platforms because you're concerned about how they would, view you within other contexts. Part of it, I think, was also related to that is about trust, and how what I've found certainly working at Doc is that there's parts of the world that really, really trust their government. Like the Nordics really do, parts of Asia do, but we probably don't very well in the UK. The US don't seem to either. And so I think there's a kind of strong element of trust here as well. And it affects how we interact with identity and how we interact with government-backed identity. And kind of then shifting into you, Richard, there's been a long resistance that we're probably all old enough on this call to remember, this kind of resistance that we have in the UK with kind of government ID cards and schemes like that, in some kind of centralized ID system. Do you think that, Richard, it's going to have a bearing upon what's going to happen next with regards to these new kind of government issued digital IDs? Do you think it's seen as sufficiently different, or do you think it's going to be a hangover from the schemes that they tried to implement in the past?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, Nick. I do think that one of the key drivers for the trust framework is that it was based on a decentralized model. So there was no central identity database controlled by the government. And this was all based on the idea of instilling trust and making it clear that the government wasn't trying to introduce a national identity card by stealth and wasn't going to be able to leverage this trust framework to carry out surveillance, profiling, and tracking of citizens. On the other hand, I'm not convinced that we still think that national identity cards are complete anathema. And the prospect of a digital identity would have the leader writers at the Daily Mail foaming at the mouth. I do think that things have changed since Tony Blair was pushing identity cards 15 years ago. And we're in a digital age. We're all pretty accustomed to digital onboarding. We're very familiar with and we're comfortable with using Apple and Google wallets for payments. So I think, the question of whether the public will really care about the distinction between a government wallet and a private sector wallet is moot. Obviously, this audience cares about it. And it's apparent from the government's call for evidence back in 2019 that the privacy campaigners, they really care about this distinction between a centralized wallet and a decentralized wallet. And the likes of Big Brother Watch, they're really worried about the privacy implications and they're worried about state surveillance. But ultimately, every country is now embracing a form of digital identity. And as you said, there are some countries that have more trust in their government than others. So I would hope that we're in a position where ultimately these wallets can all coexist and they contribute to a vibrant digital identity ecosystem that allows you to combine state-issued government digital credentials alongside private sector credentials. Yeah,
I think that's going to be key that we were able to do that. And Richard, did you cover all the concerns? I know that you're going to speak. I know you've been, I think, going into Westminster and speaking to the various parliamentary groups within government about industry concerns within the existing identity industry in the UK and how the gov.uk wallet is going to impact their businesses. What are the kind of main concerns that you're hearing and you're passing along to the government?
Well, I think the primary concern is we don't see any need for a government wallet. And it's quite difficult to reconcile the cost of a government wallet to taxpayers with the austerity message in yesterday's spring statement. As I said earlier, I do think that all of these use cases which have been flagged for the government wallet are use cases that can be fulfilled by the private sector wallets certified against the trust framework. I would emphasize again that we have the information gateway in the new Data Act. So that means that Yoti should be able to take a mobile driving license, eventually digital passports, and store them in their wallet. But ultimately, if the policy decision is that the government does want to issue its own government wallet, and that's going to be utilized in private sector use case, then the most important thing is to level the playing field. So put the private sector wallet providers in a position where they're able to compete, and we don't just deliver a government monopoly. So I think they're the key messages that we want to convey to the all-party parliamentary group next week.
Got it. Thank you. And before we move in, I thought it would be good to have kind of one final thought from you guys, and we kind of move into some of the audience questions that we have, and I'll kind of go through those in a moment. Robin, switching back to you then, if you could give one piece of advice to the UK government, and it must be identity related, as they roll out these new digital driver's licenses, what would your piece of advice be?
Yeah, I think a standard certified approach, and by that I mean there has to be a logic that if you're certified, if a citizen chooses to use X wallet, whether it be the government one or a private one, if it's certified, and that should allow you to, prove your ID at company's house, or prove your ID at, the job centre, or prove your ID at the local supermarket self-checkout. As soon as you start saying, well, we've got one certified level, but actually you can't use that for lots and lots of the sectors, citizens are basically confused as to, why is that? Are there different qualities of certification, even though there seems to only be one trust mark? So I just think if you want to adopt this and get the trust and genuinely let people choose, I don't personally think it's crazy for the government to potentially have a government ID wallet. It's not cheap to do, but there are countries where people don't trust private sector companies as much as they trust their government, and they may feel that the government is the organisations that's least likely to deceive them or whatever it might be. But reality is, let the citizen choose, rely on the certification, and then let that certification flow through so the ecosystem is super efficient, super healthy. You might like a small ID wallet, but it still allows you to get into, the supermarket and the job centre. If you kind of go to lots of places and find that your one doesn't work at those places, and the government says, I've certified it, but it's no good at my places, it just leads to a lot of frustration, and therefore adoption will take longer, and you'll get more criticisms because it won't function as well. Yeah. So really make it easy to use and make it have max utility. That makes sense. Switching back to you, Richard, do you find that when you're speaking, do you find like suggestions like Robert just made, do you find that they're receptive to suggestions that are coming in from industry? Like, do you get a good sense of that, and the frameworks or how it's going to be implemented are being adapted based on the feedback from industry? Is that your general sense?
Not really.
All right. Okay.
I mean, let me give you a concrete example. So when GDS announced the launch of the wallet in January this year, there was no reference in the press release to the trust framework. There was no advance notice, let alone consultation of the identity providers. So, everybody was caught unaware. And I think, in terms of a communications faux pas, it wasn't quite at the level of a Signal group chat where you're sharing war plans with the editor of the Atlantic magazine, but it wasn't that much better. So I think the question you asked, Robin, was, well, what advice would I give to government? I think I would say you need to improve your communications transparency, and it needs to be more collaboration with industry. And then I think the other point that I would make is that what we are developing is a an ecosystem that isn't just for domestic use. We've got to make sure that our digital identity ecosystem aligns with international digital identity schemes. So we want mutual recognition and we want technical interoperability with the Europeans' EU digital identity wallet. And I think, to be fair, that's something that I have discussed at length with DCIT, and I think they share that view.
Okay, that's good to know. And then that's a great segue actually into the first question, Richard, and as Alex is asking, thanks for the question, Alex, is anything mandated for the UK government comparable to the EU wallet? So are we lining up in some way, I guess, with not only the legislation there, but maybe some of the standards that they have in place? Alex kind of continues, and does the solution have strong customer authentication for payments, for example? What was your sense of that?
Yeah, so that is one of the distinguishing features of the European Digital Identity Wallet, that it will be used for strong customer authentication under PSD2, PSD3 directive, has a high level of assurance, and it will be mandatory for the banks from 2027 to accept the wallet for payment authorization. That isn't something that's been built yet into our ecosystem. On the other hand, I do think that gives certified identity providers scope for innovation and scope for differentiation. So I would say in a nutshell that if you look at the European Digital Identity Wallet, it's a bit more ambitious. It's offering identity verification and authentication. It's offering the ability to sign with digital signatures in the form of qualified electronic signatures. And it offers payment authorization. At the moment, most of the discourse in the UK is around how you can use the wallet to prove age, identity, and eligibility, but there isn't much discussion of signatures and payment authorization. Okay,
thank you for that answer. I've got one in from Lyle. Lyle, I hope you're well. If you're the same Lyle I think you are. Lyle is asking, do you think that the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, will insist on retention of KYC documentation? Robin, over to you for that one, please.
I think the FCA's got to really, think through how to go forward in a world where more and more stuff is digital and that the government is supporting digital, certified digital ID wallets. At the moment, neither the Gambling Commission or the FCA have a public policy view, or if you look through their JMLSGs and whatever, you're not going to find any clear guidance for compliance officers that we think GPG 45 highs are, great. And we think if it's in a reusable ID certified by the government and independently audited each year is great. There's none of that, guidance. So, you've got these quirks for the compliance officer in some of those sectors will say, I have to basically have a printout, or I have to have, we have examples where businesses say to us, I know you've read the chip and you're giving me all of the information from the chip with the consent of the user, but I also need the picture page as well, because that's what I've always needed. And I need that again. And like part of the whole point of digital ID is to stop, to data minimize where it's sensible to data minimize, and to provide all of the kind of important information to prove identity. If you really need to prove the passport number and keep a record of it, okay. But does that definitely mean you need to continue to hold photo images, which you can then print out and, show to an auditor? I don't think so. But until some of the regulators, kind of sit up and realize that that's causing a lot of cost, but also a lot of compliance officers say until the government and the regulators, are singing from the same song sheet, we are not going to change our guidance to compliance officers, and the compliance officer only gets sacked if he basically doesn't, comply with the current guidance. So they are super risk averse. people, understandably, which kind of means the innovation either doesn't happen, or you end up with this bizarre situation where you've got, public sector cryptographically signed chip passports, but then they're printing out the passport page to keep a record of that.
Got it. Very good. Thank you for that. Hans is asking, will the UK endorse EU ID wallets so that EU citizens can use their wallet and credentials in the UK to hire a car for any other use case? So I guess by endorse, Hans is meaning, will they accept EU ID credentials and are we able to verify them in the UK, I guess, for other use cases? So Richard, over to you for that one. Do you have any thoughts about that? I guess it's probably a matter of time as opposed to when, but do you have any insights there?
Yeah, so I think the European Commission's been very, very clear that it doesn't just want the European digital identity wallet to be used within European borders. Their objective is to approach third countries, and post-Brexit, we're a third country, and put in place mutual recognition agreements. And I think in the case of the European digital identity wallet, it will be straightforward for the European Commission to say to the British government, this wallet has level of assurance high. Therefore, British institutions should be accepting it for identity verification and authentication purposes. Now, the British will obviously turn around to the European Commission and say, we want reciprocity. I think that's going to be a bit more challenging because it's unlikely, in my view, that the European Commission would say that if a British wallet has level of confidence medium, that equates to level of assurance high under eIDAS. So that's a problem that they'll have to figure out. But longer term, I think there will be the political will to put in place some form of mutual recognition agreement so that we can go on holiday to the continent and we can rely upon our wallets as a proof of age or identity.
So we might get there, Richard, but it could be a long and messy road.
I think so, but I think it is a policy goal of the European Commission, and I think they're looking to engage with the DCIT team to discuss mutual recognition.
Okay, thank you.
I think also, Nick and Richard, there, I'm quite a believer that, statistics often, is pretty compelling. So there'll be lots of Europeans who come over to the UK and have to sign documents or, prove their age or prove their ID. And there'll be lots of businesses, even if the government in the UK hasn't kind of agreed a deal, but there'll be non-regulated sectors where loads of information is flowing in, which shows that a UD verified person signing a document whilst they're here, or possibly over there, but with a British business, or, showing ID, in a marketplace or whatever, they're going to see that the fraud rates are much, much lower. UD's a high standard of ID. It's not going to be easy to defraud that compared to a current putting stuff into a web form and not going to show your face. Like, clearly that the latter of those is super easier to do fraud. So there'll be lots of businesses in the UK saying, it's very easy for the European person to give me not just ID, but really good quality ID. And I'm not seeing fraud off them. And I want them to have an easy way of signing up to me because I want economic growth. I want a happy customer. I want a customer who wants the insurance from me while they drive around, the UK on holiday or on business. And it's going to be very difficult for the UK government to go, no, all of those people need to do something different. Because, the Europeans won't accept, the British thing. So we're going to, until you do, we're not going to accept your European thing. I just don't see that. I think, lots of British business will say you've got to be pragmatic here. If the UD is really popular, which it will be, and it's a really good level of, confidence and we don't see fraud on it, why would you not let your British businesses use that? You're penalising us for no good reason. And I think therefore the government will work out, okay, we've got to accept it. And whether the Europeans accept our thing, not sure.
Hopefully common sense will prevail, Robin, is the hope there, I guess. And Pierce is asking, Robin, if I could stay with you then. He's asking about, or he or she is asking about the UK digital identity. Is it only planned for individuals, or do you think there'll be an idea, kind of organisational ID wallet kind of usable for government licenses, certifications, and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, KYB is, it's not seen as the sexy end of the industry, and it's really complicated for, some businesses. It's pretty difficult to kind of get high confidence because it might just be a small business. It's only been around for a year. It's got 1 or 2 directors, and it's in a foreign country where you can't check corporate databases. So there's been a lot of pain in that sector, and I think there will be, maturing of corporate identity, and there will be corporates who issue credentials that proves that an employee does work for them, and those credentials will be removed. And that's another reason why I don't think the government wallet will work, because it will be popular for certain things, but if you want to basically issue credentials onto a wallet, you're going to be issuing them onto a private sector wallet with a contract and SLAs and all of that stuff. The government's not going to be keeping hundreds and hundreds of digital credentials from private sector companies on a government wallet. I think it's logical that if you're doing smart ID on individuals, it's logical then to be able to map those directors to an organization, enough of those individuals basically effectively vouching for each other that they are part of that organization, the organization checkable to, luckily in the UK, Companies House. And obviously, that needs to be a more trusted institution in terms of checking that, lots and lots of fake companies are not being created by bots and fake people. But yeah, I think that the plain answer is corporate ID is coming along with individual ID, and actually they're both complementary in the digital age.
Fantastic. That would seem like both time and just because of the completeness of the answer, that seems like a great place to finish up. So great chat around kind of the UK government's new digital ID wallet. We talked a lot about the different opportunities and threats that it presents, and a bunch of other stuff besides that. So Robin Toombs, CEO of Yoti, and Richard Oliphant, who is the legal consultant at RO Legal Consulting. Thank you very much for your time. Really great. And if anyone is listening remotely, then thank you for doing that. And of course, if you've signed up, we'll send this session out in a few days' time once we've had a chance to edit it and improve some of the audio levels as well. But thanks very much, guys, for jumping on. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.